it would be wildly implausible that the Ahmadabad Mint was not making its coins from imported European silver. I don't think I need a dye study to tell me that some of this silver is coming from European ships. We've already got plenty of evidence of that. We're going to be talking not about Mughal coins in general, but about one specific Mughal mint, Ahmadabad, and a period of about 20 years at that mint. And I'm going to be using that to talk about the applicability of dye studies to Mughal coinage, and making an argument essentially that we really don't have any choice but to apply dye studies to Mughal coinage because it's the only tool we've got available that will give us the answers we are interested in. So Ahmadabad, sometimes also spelt Ahmedabad, is located in Gujarat. You can see it there on the map. It isn't initially part of the Mughal Empire. Akbar arrives north of the city in about 1580, and the local sultans surrender to him. And according to Akbar's biographer, one of the two things that they agree to when they surrender is that they will read his name at the Friday prayers, and they will put his name, Akbar's name, on the coins. So at this point, it becomes a Mughal mint. I'm picking a very narrow example, and it'll become clear why later. The reason that it's potentially interesting is because there has been a long tradition going back to the 1960s in Mughal economic history, which looks at the productivity of Mughal mints. And I'm putting three names on the screen: Hassan, Musvi, and I'm going to say Stranad, and I apologize if I'm mangling that very badly. So Hassan began in the 1960s by taking public collections of Mughal coins and counting the number of coins in them. As Joe, I think, mentioned earlier when we were chatting, Mughal coins have years and they have mints on them, which makes attributing them easier than it otherwise would be. So Hassan was of the opinion, well, you just take the coins and you count how many come from which mint, how many come from which year, and that tells you when the empire is making more coins. It tells you where the empire is making most of its coins. There was some criticism of this by John Dale. John Dale suggested that maybe public collections might not be accurate reflections of the productivity of pre-modern mints. Musvi and Stranad, Musvi especially, were extremely dismissive of Dale's concerns. Writing about it, Musvi basically implies that while Dale is raising something that might exist as some kind of theoretical possibility, in reality, obviously, the collections would just represent the number of coins that were originally made. But out of deference to Dale's overabundance of caution, she would use hoards instead of public collections. Stranad does the same thing. I'm going to go a lot further than Dale in my criticism. I'm going to say counting any group of coins in almost any circumstance is almost entirely worthless as a measure of the productivity of pre-modern mint. Yeah, so I'm going to be very, very critical of these three people and their general presumption that the counting of coins tells you anything about productivity. I'm going to provide some argumentation for that later on. But I will raise from Stranad, who's the most recent of the books, three statements he makes about the mint at Ahmadabad based on the counting of coins from hoards. So the first one is he claims that around 1600, so towards the end of the reign of Akbar, and early into the reign of Jahangir, that Ahmadabad is the single most productive mint in the whole empire. I think claims by Musavian go on to like a quarter of Mughal coinage being produced in the mint. That it declined after Surat opened further south on the coast, and that the reason for this is that the mint is coining foreign silver arriving from the overseas trade. And today, I know that Shailendra Bhandari is very interested in the first of those two. I'm not going to be talking about the first of those two, because to say something useful about that, I would have to be comparing different mints, and I'm only going to be talking about Ahmadabad. However, I'm going to say straight off the bat, I would want some exceptionally compelling evidence to convince me that a provincial mint like Ahmadabad was more productive than Agra, right, at any point in Mughal history. I'm not saying it couldn't be the case. I'm just saying I'd want some pretty compelling evidence to do so. The last of those claims that he makes about it being related to overseas trade is based in part on the fact that at this period, Mughal coins have month names on them in the Persian solar calendar. Fun little piece of information for anybody who doesn't know it. I'm aware of two groups of coinage that have month names printed on the coins. One of them are coins under Jahangir and his predecessor Akbar in the early 17th century in Mughal India, and the other is Irish gun money under James at the end of the 17th century. And the fact that James and Jahangir both begin with a J is entirely coincidental. The fact that they both happen in the 17th century is, I think, probably not coincidental. I think what we're seeing is a moment when modern bureaucratic early modern states are beginning to form and might think this is a good idea and be making coinage on a scale where you could do it. You have to be making lots of coins every month, and also not have had enough experience to know it's really a very bad idea. So they would experiment with it. So I don't think the fact that these two incidences both happened in the 17th century is entirely coincidental. I think it reflects the way states are changing in the early 17th century. But the key point is, and this is shown in the graph on the bottom left of the slide, Srinard looks at that and says most of the coins get made in Azar. Now, the Persian solar calendar begins essentially where our financial year begins, works around. So Azar is corresponding to the end of our normal calendar year. And what is superficially, what is a completely reasonable argument, and I could entirely believe is true, is the idea that in the monsoon period itself, the ports on the west coast are closed, and after the monsoon period, ships come in, and when they arrive, they're carrying huge amounts of raw silver, and that silver then gets transported to Ahmadabad, and there it has to be turned into coin. And that's why we see a peak at the end of the year. And that's a perfectly reasonable. I could totally believe that is actually the case. And I'm even going to show some evidence later that suggests that might indeed be the case. What, however, I'm going to say very firmly is that graph is not evidence of it, right? That graph doesn't mean anything. If that's right, it is right through pure chance that the distribution of coins in the data Stranad is looking at happens to line up with the reality. Because it comes back to this basic point, the extant coinage is not a function of the ancient production. It is a function of the survival mechanisms in between and publication biases at our end, and those can operate at really fundamental level. You are far more likely to publish a nice hoard of silver Mughal coins, because you can read them very easily, than you are to publish a grotty hoard of coins that don't have a standard type catalogue from the late first millennium. So there is an element of bias going on. And what Moosvi and Stranad never fully acknowledge is that they are depending on a single publication. They're not actually looking at coins and hoards. They're depending on a single publication of the treasure trove reports from Uttar Pradesh. So it's one specific location, right, and a relatively narrow period of reporting. We do have two ways of actually establishing how many coins a mint made. Technically, there's three. The best way you can establish how many coins a mint makes is to ask the mint to tell you how many coins the mint made, because that's the kind of information the mint will be keeping track of. That's not usually possible in a historical situation. So the next best thing are records, right? If the mint left records of how many coins it was making, that would be perfect. That's exactly the kind of data we as historians want. And we do have a little bit of this for Ahmadabad. Paul Stevens, in his book on the coinage of the Bombay Presidency, publishes a short table for the end of 1817 and the early part of 1818, when an East India Company official reopens the mint, or says he's reopening the mint, and reports how many coins he's making. It's not perfect data. I'm not sure what the exact form of the original document is, but as reported by Paul, those are value of coins that the mint produced, not number of coins. So we would need to know the proportion of full rupees, halves, quarters, etc., to know the details. But unquestionably, records are our best evidence. And by the 17th, 16th, 17th century, records all across the world from mints do survive. You know, it's not unrealistic that the kind of historian who likes rooting around in Western Indian archives could find family records relating to the production of the Ahmadabad mint. And if they did, that would be absolutely wonderful, because it would save me doing what I've done instead, which is to use the second best method we have available to us, which is to count the number of tools that the mint used. Pre-modern coins are made with hand-engraved dies. Those dies have limited productivity. There's only a certain number of coins they can make. This gets much more complex and nuanced, but I will skip that for the moment. But basically, if a mint needs to make more coins, it needs to make more tools. So it follows that if a mint did make more tools, it probably made more coins. Right? And we established how many tools a mint made through a die study. Right? And I want to reiterate this point. This is the second best way of doing this, or technically, this is the worst way of calculating how productive a mint was, right? But we only have two options available to us, and we generally don't have records. So this is what we're stuck with for most mints. Now, there's a perfectly legitimate question somebody could ask me, which is, in practice, is it actually possible to do die studies of Mughal mints? There are, to the best of my knowledge, only two die studies of Mughal mints. There's Prashant Kulkarni's small study of the gold mohurs from Agra, the zodiac. Aman Rahman, in his study of Babur, included die identity, die counts. If somebody does know of another example, feel free to drop it in the chat and I will read it out. So at the moment, it's the case that we don't really have very many Mughal die studies, and there's a question of, well, is that because actually in practice, we really just can't do them? Before I go on to the details of whether or not we do them, I do want to say, I have spoken about this elsewhere online. Other fields at exactly the moment that Mughal economic historians started counting coins, started counting dice, right? And the field of English medieval pennies did this. And the result of that is in the intervening 50 years, right, we have loads of really useful econometric data for English medieval pennies, right? So if you're interested in a field that actually did this, that is roughly comparable, they're all in silver, right? They're relatively easily datable, right? They come from a minting system that uses a large number of different mints in different locations. You can go and listen to me pontificate, right, on the quantification of English medieval pennies. So what makes a die study easy or difficult? There are essentially 4 factors that make die studies easy or difficult. When I say easy or difficult, I can mean anywhere from trivial, this is going to take me 20 minutes, to this is practically speaking impossible for a human being to achieve in a lifetime. The first is the complexity and the clarity of the design on the coins themselves. Simple designs are harder to do a die study on. We were talking about them earlier. Western satrap coins from West India. Die studying the obverses on those is exceptionally difficult because the portrait is very, very simple and very repetitive. Mughal coins score very well in this regard. Mughal coins, though they often have elements of flan, right, have these beautiful, I'm going to call them floral backgrounds, which consist of small lines and dots behind the actual Persian characters. And those seem to, a lot of periods, be essentially at the whim of the individual engraver, meaning that they allow you very quickly and easily to establish if 2 coins are from the same or different die. This is a Jahangir from 1023. The second criteria is the variety of types. And what I'm showing you on the screen are the 8 changes of type in the period that I'm talking about. So this is from 1002 Hijra to 1027 Hijra, from late in the reign of Akbar to midway through the reign of Jahangir. So it's in the last decade of Akbar's rule. It starts to put month names on its coins. The last time that it does this is the Zodiac issue at this mint. It makes, for 5 months, it makes Zodiac coins. When it stops making Zodiac coins, it also stops specifying the month name on the coins. Variation of type makes die studies so much easier. The fundamental problem when you're identifying dies is if I've already got 20 examples, then when I get a new one, I have to compare it with 20 existing examples. If I can subdivide that so I know I don't have to compare it with certain coins, I don't need to compare the dies for the 1011 type with this diamond pattern on it with the dies from the standard Ilahi type because they're completely different, right? So if there's lots of variation in type, that makes a die study easy. Again, Mughal coins score very well in this regard because they're all dated, because they all say they're mint on them, because the Mughals are generally speaking in the habit of changing the type on a relatively regular basis. Then you have the question of the quality of both the images and the objects themselves. It is much harder to die study coins that are in poor condition than coins that are in good condition. It's much easier to do it from high resolution, well photographed coins than it is from low resolution, like this one. Here, it's a bit of a mixed bag. In general, most Mughal coins I see are in good condition because people have actively selected for Mughal coins in good condition. In almost every context, I can get hold of images. The trade-off is occasionally Akbar coins are so common that people sell them as bulk lots in auctions. So the actual individual image of the coin is not great. That image is still just about good enough to identify the die, but it's borderline, and it certainly makes the job much harder. So far, this is all very good news. It's all indicating Mughal coins relatively easy to die study. The very last one is the size of the coinage and the size of the sample. This is probably the single most important thing. So first of all, the size of the coinage. When the mint makes more dies that are functionally of the same type, it becomes more likely that the engravers will accidentally simply reproduce the same design. These are two different dies. But in this case, it's only on the left-hand side of the coin that the engraver has differed significantly in their depiction of the floral detail, right? This would be quite hard to spot at life size. You really benefit here from an oversized image. It might be quite awkward to spot if the left-hand side was off flat in both cases. When you get these kinds of issues, what you end up having to do is you can no longer do it by simply visually comparing two images. You have to use various techniques such as electronic overlays of the two images, and that slows you down enormously. The larger a coinage gets, if a coinage is very big, it is harder to die study. A coinage that originally consisted of maybe a few 100,000 coins, that's going to be very easy. A coinage that consisted of tens of millions or hundreds of millions of coins is going to be very hard to die study. And conversely, the larger the coinage is, the larger the sample you need. And if you don't have a large enough sample, and we're going to see that in places here, I do not currently have a large enough sample, right? You cannot actually discern useful information. Now, on the positive side, I will say one advantage over, right, Hassan, Moosvi, and Stranad is a die study tells you whether or not you've got a good enough sample. You don't have to guess the way you would when you're doing it with actual coins. We'll come to that. A little point I want to make, because I think it's a common misconception. Die identification is not the most time-consuming part of a die study. The most time-consuming part of a die study is gathering all the images of the coins. And, as in this case, having to go in and turn the image the right way up, right, because the reverse has been put there. Or just ensure that the reverse and obverse are the right way round. Or where somebody has sold a lot of one of each month, or thinks they've sold a lot of one of each month, because I find in most cases when they do that, they've only actually got 10 or 11 months and they've duplicated them in the thing. When they've done that, breaking all those up into individual coins, going to museums to photograph them, all of this. The most time-consuming part of a die study is gathering the sample. How good is the sample that I currently have for the Mughal mint of Ahmadabad for the period in which it produced coins with month names on? I'd first of all like to say thank you to Paul Stevens, everybody who supports Paul Stevens' website, Heinz Bonds, Ifat Hazim, all the dealers who work with Coin Archive, all the collectors who support Zeno, because at the moment I have 1,274 coins, right, that I was able to assign die identities to for today's talk. And that would be impossible without all of those people. And we measure how good our sample is by something called the index number. And very simple, you double the number of coins you have in your sample and you divide it by the total of the number of obverse and the number of reverse dies you have. And that gives you a number which indicates how good your sample is. Think of it very simply. It is the average number of coins that survive from each die, right? That survives. And here we have a table which I've color-coded because I know trying to read tables of numbers is horrible. This is a table showing on the left-hand side the year of issue, which is initially an Ilahi year, and then it's a regnal year, or sort of a Hijra year under Jahangir. sort of. There's something weird happens there in Jahangir's reign. Red means an index number of 1. And an index number of 1 means I have seen no duplicates of the same die. Every coin I have seen comes from different dies. Essentially, that is a level of sample from which I can tell you basically nothing, right? Because I have no idea whether that genuinely is the only pair of dies that was used, or whether actually there might have been 20 or 13. I just don't have enough coins surviving. The numbers in orange and yellow represent numbers with an index number below 2. An index number of 2 is very useful. I'll show you a formula later. Under the formula we usually use, at an index number of 2, we assume we have roughly half of the dies that were originally used represented. Right? And then I've put in 3, 4, and 5 showing 4 upwards. Once you get above an index number of 4, you have a pretty good idea what's going on a mint. You can estimate how many dies they originally used with a reasonable level of accuracy. You can start estimating that with some level of accuracy at 2, but at 4, you get a reasonable sense of that. You can start to look at other aspects of the mint and understand how they made coins. I'm going to talk about now. I've superimposed Trinad's little graph where he showed which things were more common. It's not super clear, but there's definite patterns in the table you can see from the coloring. My sample of Akbar coinage, which is at the top, is much worse than my sample of Jahangir coinage. Right? Now, the reason for that is very, very simple. People are much more likely to publish a Jahangir coin than they are an Akbar coin. Akbar coins are boring, right? Jahangir coins are not. The other feature, which is a little less apparent, is that peak around Aban and Azar, right, that Stranad detects in the hordes. In my data sample, that's where the sample is best, right? Now, I can't know whether or not there's a similar artifact in the data that Stranad is working from, because he never looked at the coins. He's just looking at a publication of the treasure trove reports from Uttar Pradesh. And I can look at that same treasure trove list, but I can't look at the actual coins to establish whether or not there's something weird that coins are more likely to survive in Uttar Pradesh if they come from that part of the year in Ahmadabad. So, but that is possible. So what Stranad is reading as representing the productivity of the mint could be to do with survival. It could be to do with the way people hoard coins and which coins get used. There is absolutely a very clear issue that for the 2 mints that are the 2 months that are least well represented, Ahmadabad and Shahriwar in the middle of the year, that is where our sample is absolutely the worst, right? And I think there are reasons for that. So some of this is to do with potential publication bias. You can see a like green strip across the middle, right? That's the moment when Jahangir becomes emperor and the Ahmadabad Mint issues these coins in the name of Salim. Right? They're sometimes referred to as pre-accession coinages. They are made after he comes to the throne, alongside a group of heavier weight coins, which he orders in the name of Jahangir. These are made on standard weights in the name of Salim, right? And these are rare, and they fetch good prices at auctions, and people find them interesting and exciting because they say Salim rather than Jahangir. So we get lots of publications of these. So we have a good sample of these, right? So some of this is just publication bias. Some of it might just be that the data itself is inherently unrepresentative. To produce that overall chart, Stranad combined together all the years and put them in, but there's a gap in the middle. So after Jahangir comes to the throne, Ahmadabad keeps making coins with month dates on them for about 9 months. It then stops and it doesn't restart again until his 7th regnal year. So for 5 years, the mint is not putting month names, but it stops in, or appears to stop based on the sample I've got, in Tir. But when it restarts, it appears to restart in Abad, right? And you have a similar issue at the beginning. In the 38th Ilahi year of Akbar, the mint isn't making coins with month names at the beginning of the year. It starts making month named coins partway through the year. But because nobody includes the zodiacs when they do these counts, it finishes at the end of a full year. So there are 2 years where the mint was only making coins for part of the year. So even if our coinage was otherwise a completely representative sample of what they originally made, right, we'd be missing 5 to 10% in those months. So those months would look smaller than the months around them. So that's right there in the mint's original production. It's not even something that originates in biases of selection or survival. We also have identification issues. I can't actually tell the difference between Ilahi coins that are year 40 and Ilahi coins that are year 41 from the first 4 months of the year, right? 40 and 41 initially appear to be written slightly oddly at Ahmadabad, almost like they're a cipher rather than 4 and 0 and 4 and 1 separately. And because the date occurs, it's on the reverse here, on the lower row on the right-hand side, the last character you can see part of is 4. And there's a unit digit to the right of it. But obviously you can't know what the unit digit is, except in this case, I know it's 40 or 41, right? And that it's Khordad, but I can't tell you whether it's 40 or 41. And I think I have some understanding of what the mint is doing there, but I'm not certain. So I literally just have question marks in that little section of the table. And that extends generally to all of the Ilahi coins of Akbar, between 41 and 49. You could always see the 4 or part of it. You frequently cannot see the unit. About half the time, you can't see the unit. In some cases, because I'm doing a die study, I've been able to match coins to dies and go, well, I know what the unit is there. But at the moment, it's still the case that I have approximately 500 coins that I can attribute to a correct year, and about 226 images I can't. So about a third. Both Moosby and Stranard do some very unsound things at this point. Moosby recognizes this as a serious problem, but then goes, well, I can just allocate all the stuff that I can't attribute following the pattern of the stuff that I can. So I already know that this proportion of coins goes in Khordad and this proportion goes in Isfahan Damuz. So I can just take the other coins and put them in the same proportions. And the problem is, these things aren't equally easy to read. It's always much easier to identify 46 than any of the other years because 6 is the only character that has a little projection working backwards, right? 2 and 3 and 4, and even 1 if you're at the edge of the coin, all basically look the same. 9 and 5 are not easy to distinguish if you've got the edge of the coin cut off. Ahmadabad, which is one of the months we have very few examples of, is really easy to confuse with Khordad because the bit that you can usually see on the coin is the end, and all the end says is dad, right? I'm pretty sure, having seen multiple examples, that this one's a Khordad and not
Ahmedabad, I can see, yes.
Ahmadabad, but above it on the top right is Khordad, and I'm fairly sure it's Khordad and not the month Ahmadabad, but usually that's quite hard to distinguish. And because one of those is rare and one of those is common, you can see very easily people doing hoards attributing all of them to Khordad, right? They've seen some clear Khordads and they've seen some unclear coins that look similar. All of them get attributed. I've certainly done that as I was doing this. There's certain months that are hard. Mir and Sharawar, similarly, very hard to tell apart in practice on the coins. You wouldn't think so, given that they should be spelled completely differently, right? But given the bit of the inscription you can see, they're actually quite hard to distinguish. So we have this kind of problem layered in on top. All of which is further to justify my point that we should not just be counting the coins, because the John Dale's criticism that there are biases at work is not a purely theoretical argument, as Moosby thought. It is a reality. The other problem we've got is sometimes the date on the coin is just wrong, right? The coin at the top, on the bottom left of the obverse, you've got 22. So this is 1022. Almost certain it must have been issued in 1023 or 1024. The engraver has just put the wrong number on the coin. The coin at the bottom very clearly says 1027, right? It is not a 1027 coin. It is definitely from 1026, right? Now, that one's slightly more complicated, and people could ask me in the questions, but exactly what year it is at that point is a matter of some debate, right? So the engraver might actually technically be right. That might be the Hijri year 1027 when he engraves it, but most engravers at the mint know at this point they're supposed to be putting 1026 on it, not 1027. So sometimes the engravers just get it wrong. Right. And again, that's not something you can see when you're just counting the coins. Right. So finally, I've made the argument that we need to do die studies. I've made the argument that die studies are the only way we've got of reconstructing the kind of data people who want to work on Mughal economic history are interested in. Unless somebody suddenly finds a bunch of family records for all of the mints. And I would actively encourage anybody who's in archives to look for them, because I'm sure some at least are there. But does the data I've got actually say anything useful? The answer is obviously all the bits that are orange and red, no, right? That isn't enough data yet. First thing it does tell us is the zodiac coinage at Ahmadabad is weird, right? And this is genuinely useful new information. When Kulkarni did a die study of the Agra Mint, the one problem with the die study, which is otherwise excellent, it's a really good piece of work, is that Prashant couldn't answer the question, well, is what they're doing normal? Is that just how they normally make coins? Because he didn't have anything to compare it against. Right, I can now compare what they do with the zodiac coins, which, by the way, they make one pictorial die. And then they use loads of epigraphic dies with it. But there's only ever one pictorial die for each zodiac symbol at Ahmadabad. That is very, very odd. The normal practice is the die that contains the month name is about half as common as the die that doesn't, because that die can be reused from month to month, and they definitely do that. They reuse dies from month to month. So the zodiac coinage is really, really weird. Now, that immediately is a very negative thing in terms of us trying to understand production, because it means we can't use the number of tools they used as a guide to how many zodiac coins they made, because their procedures are clearly different to how they were the previous year. So we don't know whether or not the dies were equally productive. Right? So there's always limitations on what we can do with die studies, but they generally contain information about their own limitations in the die study. And apart from anything else, it's kind of nice to know that it is just weird. And it does kind of explain why the mint immediately stops doing it the moment Jahangir leaves the city and does not go back to ever putting zodiac symbols on the coins again, because it was obviously a bonkers idea and they didn't really know how to deal with the imperial instruction. This is from one of the periods where the sample is not weird. The mint's doing its normal thing, but the sample's quite good. And that's from 1021, 1022. And what you can see at the top is kind of the table of data that I've got available. And this is how I kind of present it. And you can see they are doing one. This is, I mentioned it earlier, they're doing very odd thing. Around 1020 Hijra, the lunar calendar of the Hijra falls roughly in sync with the solar calendar. And for the next 3 or 4 years after that, the mint synchronizes the two of them. So from that point onwards, you only get one regular year with one Hijra. I assume that somebody out there probably knows about some actual textual sources that would tell us roughly what's going on. But what I'm guessing is going on is that the mint is forcing the lunar year to conform to the solar year, right? So that these are no longer true Hijra years. But we've now got a reasonable idea of what the normal practice of Ahmadabad is. For most of these coins, we can make estimates of how many obverse and reverse dies we're using. Again, obverse and reverse here, I can't really tell you which side is the obverse and which side is the reverse, right? I suspect the fact that the month dies are less common is a procedural thing, but normally we would assume that because there are fewer of them, they're the obverse, right? So if it wasn't for the weirdness of the month procedure, we'd assume they're the obverse. What we can do is convert to the original number of dies the mint had. Right? We use this formula. The number of dies the mint originally had is the number of coins in your sample multiplied by the number of dies divided by the difference between the two. Why do I use this formula? It's 2 reasons. It is the only formula numismatists have available which has been independently verified by 2 separate historical pieces of data. And it's really, really easy to remember and use. The second of those being genuinely quite important. However, I can't just use it willy-nilly. There are some caveats. I've excluded from the table I'm showing you on the right the zodiacs for the reason I just mentioned. Something is weird about the procedure, so it doesn't matter whether they're using more or less dies. I can't tell you whether or not they're making more or less coins with them. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm not extrapolating using that formula for any group of coins where the overall index number is less than 2 or where I have fewer than 5 coins. And the reason for that is very simple. The worse the sample gets, the smaller the absolute number of coins, the less reliable the formula is. There's no kind of hard and fast rule for where to draw a line, but you have to draw a line, right? And say below this point, the only methodologically responsible thing to do is not make an estimate. And as you can see, the result of that is I have no data for Akbar's Ilahi types because that's where my sample is worst. I only start to get data once I'm dealing with Jahangir. There's additional problems with, well, how do you count this? What I did was just add together the estimate for the obverse and reverse dies, right? Because they do broadly seem to be in about the same proportions. Seemed reasonable, but you could definitely do it other ways, right? And you might worry that if the mint has changes of procedure, that's creating an artifact in there. And then, of course, you've got the question of, well, what's the relationship of this to production, right? Is it necessarily linear? Does the mint always make a certain number of dies, right? No matter how many coins it's going to make, and then only make additional dies when it needs them? If it was doing that, there wouldn't be a linear relationship between the two. Again, problems that you've got here, and I've talked about extensively elsewhere. But what we do have, I've again color-coded it because reading numbers is awful. Light blue, fewer than 10 dies. Mid blues, 10 to 20, then 20 to 30, and then the dark blue is over 30. And straight away, well, okay, it looks like Stranad's, what was basically a guess, might not be completely wrong, except that he put the peak in Azar, and the peak we're saying here is in Aban, right? That's when the mints. But it's definitely more complicated than that. You've got that dark blue section in Qudrat and Tir of Jahangir's second regnal year. And that's particularly weird because at that point, the mint is also making heavyweight coins without the month name on at the same time. So that's only part of the mint's production at that moment. So the question of why does there appear to be an intensive production there? Interesting thing. So we can tell something, right? The good news, so we've got some seasonal patterns, but it's clearly more complicated than Stranad and Moosvi assumed, and you couldn't see that in their data, and you can see that even with quite poor dye studies data. The good news is that the answer to the question, are Mughal dye studies possible, is a very clear yes, right? This was not so difficult. And in this case, I think it's worth saying, I haven't made the attempt to be systematic that a proper dye study would do, right? This is a preliminary study only of the sources that were most immediately available to me. So I have Jahangir's from the BM, but not Akbar's, because we haven't taken photographs of them. I've not tried to trawl the quite cumbersome ANS database to pull theirs back yet. Most, I'm essentially, I haven't looked at physical auction catalogs, which would contain additional examples, only digital. The 1,250 or so I gave you at the beginning, I'd be very surprised if I couldn't, with a more systematic effort, double that number, which means we can answer, at least for Ahmadabad, at least for Akbar and Jahangir, the question I asked at the beginning about the relationship between sample and population size, which is, yes, out there, available, are enough Mughal coins to create accurate data, at least for the reigns of Akbar and Jahangir, right, of the number of dyes the Ahmadabad mint was using. And I would be very surprised if Ahmadabad was some kind of weird outlier, right? This probably means that's true for other Mughal mints. And while I suspect the sample gets worse after Jahangir, I suspect, it's not as good for Aurangzeb. I suspect it's a lot worse once you get down to the East India Company, right? It looks like the kind of data that Mughal economic historians want about the productivity of Mughal mints is recoverable from the sample of Mughal coins that we have available to us today.